Gerarda and Jener Cox's first encounter took place in a cozy cafe back in the distant year of 1986. As soon as Mark crossed the threshold of the establishment, he immediately noticed a charming girl who worked there as a waitress. Her blue eyes and sincere smile captured the young man's heart at first sight. Jener's beauty was simply enchanting. "I was so impressed that I even lost my gift of speech for a moment," Mark later recalled. However, his excessive shyness prevented him from getting to know the girl better that day. Fate brought Mark and Jener together again only 4 years later. As it turned out, they both worked in the same business center in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mark often visited Jener at work but could never muster up the courage to ask her out. Jener, on the other hand, was completely different from the shy Gerarda. Confident in herself, she always openly expressed her thoughts. So one day, the girl approached Mark herself and asked directly, "So when are you finally going to ask me out on a date?" These words marked the beginning of a passionate romance that, 3 years later in October 1993, culminated in a wedding. At that time, Mark was 25, and Jener was 23. Like most newlyweds, they didn't even think about staying together for life. The first years of married life passed cloudlessly, in love and harmony. This lasted for about 15 years. But everything changed with the financial crisis of 2008. It forced the Gerardas to look at many things differently, as Mark himself later admitted. Both he and Jener found themselves out of work and began to experience a lack of funds, which led to frequent quarrels. They took on any side jobs, but they could not return to their usual standard of living. Therefore, in November 2011, the Gerardas decided to move to the small town of Greenwell in South Carolina, where both managed to find new jobs. Mark got a job as a marketing specialist, and Jener as a sales manager. The change of scenery benefited the couple. According to Mark, he and his wife felt a spiritual closeness again. Walks along picturesque mountain trails, relaxing on the beach, all this added romance to their relationship. But family idyll did not last long. In 2017, Jener was suddenly fired from her job, and she could not find a new one for a long time. This greatly affected the woman. She lost her former self-confidence, as if she had turned into a shadow of the Jener she had always been. Mark didn't tell anyone, but in his heart, he was disappointed that his wife had fallen into such a slump for the first time in her life. Then the man decided to act. He began to look for a job in another state, hoping that a change of scenery would help refresh their relationship again. Soon Mark saw a vacancy for a creative director in the marketing department at the University of Delaware. Without wasting time, he sent his resume. Surprisingly, the response came very quickly, and it was personally from 33-year-old Meredith Chapman, who was to become Mark's immediate supervisor if he successfully passed the interview. "Your resume interested us very much. We will be glad to meet with you next Thursday," the letter said. Of course, Mark could not miss such an opportunity and immediately went to Delaware. The interview with Meredith lasted about an hour. And although the final decision was to be made by senior management, the young woman immediately informed Mark that he was hired. It was obvious that Gerarda appealed to her not only as a professional in his field. Despite her young age, Meredith had already achieved considerable career heights. Born in Pennsylvania in 1984, she graduated from the University of Delaware, earned a master's degree in public relations, and at the age of 31, she already held the position of Senior Director of Marketing. Since 2009, Meredith had been married to Luke Chapman, a former member of the New Hartkoff City Council in New Jersey. The couple lived in the Fairfield Crest area of Delaware. They had no children, just like the Gerarda family. From the first minutes of meeting Meredith, Mark felt her interest not only as a specialist but also as a man. She was incredibly bright, energetic, passionate about her work. I just couldn't take my eyes off her. Young, beautiful, smart. After just 5 minutes of conversation, I told her, "I want to work with you." Mark shared his impressions. Upon returning to Greenwell, he enthusiastically began to persuade his wife to move to Delaware. Jener, who was still depressed, did not immediately understand the reason for her husband's elated mood. But after thinking about it, she still agreed. So in November 2017, Mark went to Wilmington, and Jener stayed in Greenwell for a while to rent out their house and settle some affairs. 40-year-old Mark was happy to start a new life in the North. The prospect of working with Meredith inspired him tremendously. Did he realize then that this would be the beginning of the end of his marriage? Most likely, yes. For the first month and a half, Mark lived in Delaware alone. During this time, he and Meredith had time to get to know each other well and realized that they had a lot in common. One time, when her husband Luke was not at home, Meredith invited Mark over for a glass of wine. Recalling that night, Gerarda said that it was surprisingly easy to communicate with Meredith. Hours of conversation passed unnoticed. He shared with her his experiences of losing his parents and brother, talked about his wife who had lost interest in life. I was in a terrible confusion. On the one hand, Jener and I had lived together for 25 years, and in general, our marriage was a happy one. But on the other hand, next to Meredith, I felt incredible. She was an exceptional woman with whom I felt 20 years younger. I don't know how it happened, but in early December 2017, I had already asked her out on a date, Mark confessed. Unlike Jener, Meredith was not stingy with compliments, constantly emphasizing what a wonderful specialist and person Mark was. Jener had not praised her husband for a long time, so such attention from Meredith made a big impression on him. Just 4 weeks after they met, Mark and Meredith were already openly dating, and it was in a restaurant that they first kissed. Later, Mark said that he felt terrible guilt for betraying his wife. He even tried to convince Meredith that they should stop before it was too late. But in response, he heard a confession that she had been in an unhappy marriage for 9 years, and life was too short to waste it on those who do not value true feelings. Mark could not disagree with this statement and allowed himself to get carried away by the maelstrom of passion. Even before Jener had time to move to her husband in Delaware, Mark and Meredith had already met secretly several times. So when his wife finally found herself in a new place, she immediately noticed that Mark had changed. Despite her feigned indifference, Jener was a very perceptive and sensitive woman. She quickly guessed that her husband had a mistress. It was not in her rules to turn a blind eye to this. Jener decided to directly ask Mark about her suspicions. He denied everything, which only strengthened his wife's suspicions of his infidelity. Of course, there was no complete certainty, so Jener hired a private detective to track her husband and find out the name of his rival. Shortly before Valentine's Day 2018, Jener received irrefutable evidence of Mark's betrayal from the detective, photos, screenshots of correspondence with Meredith Chapman. Now, with all this in hand, she directly told her husband that she knew more than enough about his affairs. Seeing the evidence, Mark realized that there was no point in denying it and confessed, "Yes, I met with Meredith a couple of times, but it's just an affair, nothing more." Jener was devastated but found the strength to sit down with her husband at the negotiating table and discuss the situation. They agreed to try to restore their relationship by starting to see a family psychologist. The first session went well, but before the second, something unexpected happened. Putting on his jacket, Mark noticed a rectangular object fall out from under the lining. At first, he thought it was an anti-theft sticker, but after tearing the lining, he saw a voice recorder. Mark was terribly angry and demanded an explanation from Jener. She stated that she just wanted to make sure he had really stopped seeing Meredith. The Gerarda's relationship was rapidly falling apart, and at the end of February 2018, Mark informed Jener that he would file for divorce in 2 months. Such a delay was due to procedural issues in the legislation of the state of Delaware. In addition, they would still have to live under the same roof. Meanwhile, Meredith Chapman also began the process of divorcing Luke. She told him that she was leaving him for another man. In addition, she was actively looking for a new job to move and start a new life with Mark. In early March, Meredith was offered the position of assistant vice president at a university in Pennsylvania. She happily informed Mark about this, and the lovers, no longer hiding, began to plan a move to another city. While Meredith and Mark's romance was developing, Jener began to see a psychologist, Shelley Brennan. Later, the woman would tell the police that resentment was growing in Jener's soul that her husband had exchanged her for a younger mistress. But no matter how hard the psychologist tried to help, Jener was sinking deeper and deeper into an emotional abyss. The situation was aggravated by the woman's fears, because she still had not found a new job. Every day Jener was getting worse. At one point, she even threatened Mark that she would do something bad if he did not change his mind about getting divorced. Mark was alarmed by these words, so when his wife gave him a list of things they had to do before the divorce, he agreed to do it. Mark hoped that this would help Jener finally come to terms with the situation. In fact, his wife was desperately clinging to the slightest hope that she could get her husband back. She believed that if they did everything on the list together, went to a restaurant, to the movies, spent an evening on the beach, then their relationship could still be saved. Thinking that he was helping Jener to make the parting easier, Mark was actually giving her a reason to dream about a future together. In parallel with completing the tasks from the list, Jener began to publish posts on social networks, adding old photos of their couple to them. You can find a way out of any difficulties. We have been through a lot together: betrayal, depression, trauma, loss of trust. But now we are on the right track, she wrote. When Mark saw these posts on Jener's page in early April, he was dumbfounded. It became clear that he needed to tell his wife frankly, they had no and could not have a future together. In response, Jener silently got up and left the room. Mark thought that he had finally made everything clear. But he did not take into account one thing: how terrible the revenge of a betrayed woman can be. On the evening of April 23, 2018, Mark and Meredith agreed to meet for dinner and then go to the house that she had recently rented near her new job. Meredith was very late, which was not typical of her. And then Mark got a message from his wife: she won't come. A minute later, another one arrived: you ruined my life, Mark. I hope you never find happiness. Goodbye. At first, Mark took it as a bad joke. He rushed to call his wife first, then his mistress, but neither answered. Then he got into his car and rushed to Meredith's house. What he saw inside was forever etched in his memory. At the entrance to the living room lay the dead Meredith, and opposite her was Jener. The latter held a pistol in her hands. Mark immediately called an ambulance, hoping that the women could still be saved. But the medics who arrived at the scene pronounced both dead. As it turned out later, Jener had purchased the weapon back on March 20th but decided to use it only after she had exhausted all attempts to get Mark back. Bank statements showed that before going to Meredith's house, she had visited the shooting range 3 times. According to the official version of the investigation, Jener entered the house through a window during the day when Meredith was at work. She waited there for several hours and opened fire as soon as her rival crossed the threshold. In a farewell letter that Mark later found in his email, Jener blamed him for everything that happened. She said that her husband had left her no choice and forced her to take such a desperate step. Years later, in an interview on the occasion of the release of his book, Irreparable: 3 Lives, 2 Deaths, 1 Story to Tell, Mark Gerarda admitted that if he could turn back time, he would have acted differently. I broke her heart. I regret most of all that I made her feel that she had no other way out, he said. I didn't want to hurt her because I loved her. And I still love her. How I wish I could take it all back. Although Mark claimed that he wrote the book so that people would learn from his mistakes, his sincerity was doubted. The man was accused of trying to profit from the tragedy. But he rejected these accusations, stating that all royalties from the book would go to charity to help those who found themselves in difficult life circumstances. Now Mark continues to work in the advertising industry, living alone, not counting the 2 dogs that he and his wife once got together. As he himself admits, he likes being alone. Recently, a friend told me that he feels sorry for me because I'm alone. I replied, yes, I live alone, but I don't feel lonely. I have a great time by myself. The main thing is to learn to listen to yourself and live in harmony with yourself. Then company becomes not a necessity, but an opportunity. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.